Hello, class, and welcome back as we wrap up this chapter on the dawn of discovery by introducing some important topics that will be extremely relevant next year in United States history. One, both mercantilism, the economic policy dominant through the age of exploration, as well as the triangular trade and the North Atlantic slave trade. Again, these topics will be focused on much more heavily next year. The goal of today is to simply provide some background information and set the stage for where we'll be moving in the next chapter in the course once we talk about the emergence of modern states. So please title your notes for today, Mercantilism and the Triangular Trade. Please keep in mind that during this lesson, we'll be covering some heavy topics, most notably the enslavement of Africans and their transportation to the New World, as well as the conditions that many of these populations faced in this growing new culture in the Americas. So just to take a step back, again, you'll focus on this in much greater detail in United States History 1, but early labor in the New World beyond Native Americans came in the form of what was called indentured servitude. Basically, the idea is that a person could sell themselves or sell their labor for a period of time in exchange for passage to the New World. So obviously, settlers needed raw materials for trade to send back to the mother country. So this created a need for labor and these labor contracts. It's important to note that the difference between indentured servitude and slavery, if you're an indentured servant, you're essentially selling yourself for a limited amount of time. You're still considered to be a human being. You're simply under contract to basically extort your labor in exchange for this passage to the New World. Once your contract expires, you're supposed to be set free. In many cases, owners or masters took advantage of their indentured servants and refused to release them from their contracts, didn't pay them in accordance with what their contracts originally said. And there were many instances where people were taken advantage of for a very long amount of time. So we talked about this previously when we spoke about initial contact, but the encomienda system will come to dominate Central America and South America as well. So an encomienda essentially was a grant given by the Spanish government to an explorer or settler to essentially extort native labor forces. It's essentially slavery, but the idea was supposed to be that you were given permission to use Native Americans for ranching and farming and mining. This really was a precursor to the slave trade that we'll be exploring in just a moment. Of course, the issue becomes Native Americans are dying in mass numbers, and also because of their nativist mindset, they have a heavy resistance to being enslaved and being extorted for labor. So ultimately, they make a poor labor force for Europeans, and it's one of the contributing reasons why Europeans will ultimately turn to Africa for a new form of labor. So it's also important to note as well that predominantly early explorers and settlers were men. So in many cases, there was interracial marriages or relationships between Spanish settlers and Native American women, creating what's been called the mestizo population, basically a new population of people of mixed blood. In the painting to the left of the screen, you're seeing a Spanish settler, a Native American woman, and their child, of course, of mixed blood between the two of them. So the encomiendas given by the Spanish government essentially create a system of social classes in the Spanish colonies, kind of reminiscent of the feudal era pyramid that you saw earlier in this class, where you're kind of seeing this hierarchy. And you'll notice that Native American Indians are all the way on the bottom of the pyramid. They are even below African slaves. So, as the colonies are established in the New World as time passes, a really intricate trade network emerges called the triangular trade system. There are numerous versions of the triangular trade that involve different commodities and products being sold, but the central idea is that it's trade across the Atlantic Ocean, the transatlantic trade. So the slave trade was the most important part of this. This has been called the Middle Passage. This is the passage from Africa to the West Indies. So you can see in this image over here to the right in this diagram, the arrow that goes from Africa to North/South America, the West Indies, would be the Middle Passage, the middle part of the triangle. The most important part because this will essentially move populations of people from Africa to the New World. Just to show you some variations of the triangular trade, you can see here we have raw materials like iron and rum being sent to Africa. You have African slaves being sent to the West Indies, and then molasses and sugar being sent to the 13 colonies. In this variation, you're seeing basically the Americas linked as one destination. And in this case, you're seeing pots, pans, firearms being sent from England to Africa as Africa is being colonized and explored. Again, we're getting slaves from Africa to the Americas, and then from the Americas to England, we're getting things like raw materials, lumber, iron, and grain. So, in terms of the slave trade, as I mentioned previously, Native Americans were dying rapidly following the Columbian Exchange and the introduction of disease in the New World. So, of course, a new labor force is needed, so Europeans turn toward Africans. The slave trade becomes absolutely huge. It becomes an essential part of American life. Their economy is completely contingent on the continuation of slave labor, the sale of slaves, the purchase of slaves, slave auctions. And of course, next year in U.S. History 1, you'll spend extensive time exploring slave culture, the religion of slaves, the experience of being a slave, and ultimately the brutality of this institution. By the year 1600, 300,000 Africans had been essentially kidnapped and transported from their homes in Africa to the New World. It's important to note that in many cases, it was actually warring tribes who were abducting other Africans. For instance, you might have Europeans contracting themselves with one African tribe, and then those tribesmen would be kidnapping members of a different tribe in Africa, giving them to the Europeans, then ultimately they'd be sent to the New World to be enslaved. By 1870, which would be the end of the American Civil War, there were 9.5 million Africans in the New World by that point. So I want you to just take a quick look at this primary source, and then you'll answer the question that follows. This highlights the experience of being transported from a ship on the Middle Passage from Africa to the New World. So pause the video here if you need to, and then answer this question. Describe the living quarters of slaves who were being transported on the Middle Passage. So, as you read in that passage, quarters were extremely tight and grotesque. The goal of many of these shippers were to compact as many Africans in a single ship as possible, because essentially they were being used as commodities. Obviously, it's very expensive for these ships to go across the Atlantic Ocean, and it takes several months. So they were packing people as tightly as humanly possible, a horrifying experience where people are getting no fresh air, disease is spreading rapidly, people are being thrown overboard who become ill. If you are on the bottom part of these very tightly put together rows, you may be lying next to a deceased corpse, you may be covered in human excrement. Just a horrifying experience that took a psychological toll on enslaved people for sure. So I'm going to show you a quick video clip and then we'll resume in just a moment.
The thing that distinguishes slavery in Africa from Atlantic slavery is race. Europeans set in motion a system of slavery that was predicated on the idea that certain people were marked as enslavable. We've learned a great deal about the Middle Passage in the last 40 years or so. The volume of the trade involved the removal of about 12.5 million people from the African continent. The Middle Passage was the middle leg of a voyage that starts in Europe. The first passage is from Europe to Africa. The Middle Passage is the journey from Africa to America. And then the third passage is the journey back from America to Europe. The Middle Passage could take anywhere from 2 to 3 months. Men and women were separated. Men typically were held in the lower belly of the ship. The roof, if you would, was quite low, probably about 4 feet high. So people couldn't stand. African men were shackled together and they were packed so closely together in a spoon-like position. And they would stay like that for pretty much the entire journey. You're talking about hundreds of people. You're at 120 degrees. It smells terrible. There are actually people dying around you, which has to be a traumatic experience for everybody on board. Maybe 10% of voyages, we know there was some attempt to rise up, to kill the crew, to try to turn the boat around, to change their destinies. Historians have a hard time capturing what the Middle Passage must have felt like for enslaved men and women. It's a voyage that is deeply disorienting. It's a voyage to a place that you can't anticipate. You don't know what's going to happen to you. I don't think we have adequate words to capture that experience. I know this ain't your home, but it's where you gotta be.
So I'm going to show you an additional video that delves into an infamous slave auction. Please keep in mind that some of this footage might be a bit difficult to watch. A key part of slave auctions really were twofold depending on who was being purchased, whether it be a man or a woman. In the case of men, the price or value of the purchase of a male slave was generally correlated with age and perceived strength. Typically, until about age 25 to 30, the price would go up, after which, at that point, which would be considered midlife at the time, it would be going down. For females, on the other hand, price was correlated with perceived fertility or perceived sexuality. As difficult as this is to grasp in a modern sense, for many slavers, females were an opportunity to create more slaves, either through breeding or through rape, in which case, in many cases, masters had their own children enslaved, but it provided essentially a free form of forced labor. So check out this video and we'll resume in just one moment.
People in the Americas knew when a ship arrived because they could smell it. If the wind was blowing from offshore, people would know that for sure. Maybe a day before it came. It would be sort of like a septic tank coming towards you. That's what it would smell like.
The sale itself would happen either on board the ship or a warehouse nearby. Let the scramble commence. Slaves would be inspected by prospective buyers who would poke and prod and open their mouths and all these things to try to assess the physical capacity of the slave. Once you get into the era of print, there were always advertisements in the newspapers. A colonial newspaper is a small thing. It's 4 pages maybe. And on that last page, property is being advertised: land, horses, wagons, and human beings. And they would use adjectives to sort of entice buyers: lusty slaves, a fresh cargo of prime Africans from such and such a region.
So how much wealth does one person represent? For men, price rose with age up until around 25 or 30, and then it started to decline.
Once we get to the 19th century, the cost of an enslaved person would approximate the cost of an automobile in today's dollars. To own 50 or 100 enslaved people is to be a very wealthy person indeed.
For women, it's a little bit different. Price is correlated with perceived years of remaining fertility, or is linked to perceived sexual attractiveness. One of the attractions of slavery for enslavers, particularly men, is the sexual access that they believe it gives them. The role of violent, forced sexuality in the trade. we know that it was quite extensive. I think we have to come to grips with the fact that that was really in the minds of enslavers and other whites, and was really in the practices of slavery.
So, to wrap up this lesson, it's important to tie in the financial backbone of what is really happening during this time period. And it's quantified by mercantile economics, more simply put, mercantilism. So it's a three-part system. It's really important to understand the different legs of this. So at its core, mercantilism or mercantile policy is a system of trade. Okay. Basically, the gist of it is the colonies are producing raw materials which are being sent to their mother country. Then, what the mother country is ultimately doing is they're taking those raw materials and transforming them into manufactured goods. So, say for example, you're sending lumber from the colonies to England. England is turning that lumber into chairs and tables, and then ultimately they're selling it back. But here's the bottom line: the colonies end up paying a lot more than they would have paid by simply making these manufactured goods themselves. This is one of the items that leads to the American Revolution, where colonists are essentially asking themselves, why are we paying all of this money to our mother country when we can really do these things on our own? Part two involves strict government laws controlling trade, which you'll see in a moment comes in the form of the Navigation Acts, basically where the mother country is forbidding their colonies from trading or selling things to other nations, basically putting a very tight grip around their colonies and preventing them from becoming self-sufficient or profitable. And the final part of this is the mother country having more exports than imports. So they're utilizing their colonies essentially to trade back and forth between the two of them. And therefore, the mother country needs to import less from other nations around the world. Through use of their colonies, the mother country ultimately becomes self-sufficient. So I have one final video clip that I'm going to show you. It's very brief. It highlights mercantile economics.
In the 17th and 18th centuries, European nations gauged their wealth by the amount of silver and gold in their treasuries. To fill its coffers, England incorporated its colonies into a system of mercantilism. Under this system, colonial ships carried raw materials to the English, who would then transform these materials into manufactured goods. English traders would then sell these goods back to the colonies and to other European nations.
Ideally, the colonies should provide raw materials and should consume manufactured goods. So you have this kind of closed circuit of raw materials coming into England, feeding into English industry, then the products of English industry coming back to the colonists and the colonists buying them.
To ensure that the money leaving English colonies flowed to the English treasury, England restricted colonial trade with foreign powers and sometimes banned it completely. Though most colonists tolerated mercantilism in the 1600s, this economic system eventually provoked smuggling and ultimately led to violent conflict between the colonies and the crown within the next century.
So just to show you a quick visual of what mercantile economics looks like, take a look at this infographic. So if you look on the left of the screen, you will see the New World colonies, places like Massachusetts and South Carolina. They have raw materials: timber, iron, fish, indigo, cotton, rice. And they're going to take these raw materials as resources and send them to Europe as basically raw materials. Then, once these raw materials are in the mother country, they'll be turned into manufactured goods: fabric, pots, tables, and then these manufactured goods would be sold back to the colonies for a jacked up price. So essentially, the mother country is making out like a bandit and making a lot of money. Colonists are becoming upset and wondering why they're paying this extra money on these goods. So, under Oliver Cromwell, who we'll talk about in the next chapter, England places the Navigation Acts on the 13 colonies, which basically prevents them from selling things to foreign nations other than their mother country. So, because colonies were trying to make a profit themselves, they're also selling things to places like France and Spain. This is violating mercantile economics. So the Navigation Acts at their core are trying to prevent that from happening. It simply leads to smuggling, though. And again, this is one of the items that will pave the road to the American Revolution, where colonists ultimately want to gain their own autonomy and sever ties with England. And you can see in this cartoon over here on the right, we have the mother country represented as the queen, and the colonies are essentially serving her all of these raw materials, gold and silver, and other goods. Just to show you some things that were done by the Navigation Acts, no country could trade with the colonies unless the goods were shipped in either colonial or English ships. All vessels had to be operated by crews that were at least 3/4 English. The colonies could export certain products only to England. All goods traded between the colonies and Europe first had to pass through an English port. So basically, they're inspecting the ships. They're making sure that the crew is English, really preventing any opportunities for the colonists to smuggle or make money off of their raw materials. Just to wrap things up for this lesson, we're not going to talk about the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War very much in our class. It's very much going to be taking place in the background. You'll talk about this extensively in United States History 1, but basically the French and Indian War is a war between the British and the French over their possessions in the New World. Ultimately, the reason it's called the French and Indian War was because the use of Native American populations in the fighting was essential for warfare. The British are ultimately victorious. They're able to keep the 13 colonies and ultimately gain possessions to the west of the Appalachian Mountains. However, this is the most important part, and you can see this pictured here on the map. So, just to the west of the 13 colonies, the English crown passes what's called the Proclamation of 1763, creating the Proclamation Line of 1763, basically a boundary that prevents the colonists from settling or moving or exploring beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Why is the British Crown doing this? It's limiting the potential power of colonists and containing their possessions in the New World to ensure that England can maintain control. This is yet another thing that's going to very slowly start paving the road toward the American Revolution, which we'll talk about in our future chapter on the Enlightenment.